Bashar al-Assad, a name synonymous with the Syrian civil war, was once an unassuming ophthalmologist practicing in London. He led a life far removed from the political turmoil that would later engulf his homeland. In the bustling streets of London, Bashar was known more for his gentle demeanor and dedication to his patients than for any political ambition. His colleagues and friends saw him as a man of science, committed to the well-being of others, with little interest in the power struggles of his family's regime. Born into the powerful Assad family, Bashar was thrust into the spotlight after the untimely death of his elder brother, Bashar, the heir apparent to their father's presidency. Bashar was groomed from a young age to take over the reins of power, embodying the strength and charisma expected of a future leader. Bashar, on the other hand, was the quieter, more introspective sibling, content to pursue a career in medicine. The sudden loss of Bashar in a tragic car accident in 1994 changed everything, shattering the family's plans and thrusting Bashar into a role he had never anticipated. This unexpected turn of events set in motion a chain reaction that would forever alter the course of Syria's history. The country, already a complex tapestry of ethnic and religious groups, faced an uncertain future. Bashar's return to Syria marked the beginning of a dramatic political transformation. The once quiet ophthalmologist was now at the center of a storm, navigating the treacherous waters of Syrian politics. His father's advisors and the ruling elite began to mold him into a leader, preparing him for the immense responsibilities that lay ahead. Bashar's early life was a stark contrast to the brutal dictatorship he would later preside over. Growing up, he enjoyed a relatively normal childhood, shielded from the harsh realities of his father's authoritarian rule. He attended school, played with friends, and developed a passion for science and technology. His interest in medicine led him to pursue a career as an ophthalmologist, a path that seemed worlds away from the political machinations of the Assad regime. Educated in Damascus and later specializing in ophthalmology in London, he was seen as quiet, reserved, and lacking the ruthlessness often associated with his father's regime. His time in London exposed him to different cultures and ideas, broadening his perspective and shaping his worldview. Bashar's colleagues in the medical field admired his dedication and professionalism, often remarking on his gentle bedside manner and his ability to connect with patients on a personal level. This image of a compassionate doctor stood in stark contrast to the brutal image of his father, Hafez El-Assad. His marriage to Asma Akras, a British Syrian investment banker, further fueled hopes for a more modern and open Syria. Asma, with her Western education and progressive views, was seen as a potential catalyst for change. The couple's union symbolized a bridge between East and West, raising expectations that Bashar's leadership might usher in an era of reform and modernization. Together, they represented a new generation of Syrians, one that could potentially steer the country towards a brighter future. However, fate had other plans. The weight of his family's legacy and the expectations of the ruling elite began to shape Bashar's path. The hopes for a more open and progressive Syria started to fade as the realities of maintaining power in a deeply divided country became apparent. The pressures of leadership and the need to assert control over a volatile political landscape began to take their toll. Bashar's death in a car crash in 1994 forced Bashar back to Syria, where he was quickly groomed for leadership. The sudden and tragic loss of his brother was a turning point, not just for Bashar, but for the entire Assad family. Bashar's return to Syria marked the beginning of an intense period of preparation, as he was thrust into the spotlight and began to take on more prominent roles within the government. The once reluctant heir was now being shaped into a leader, with the weight of his family's legacy resting heavily on his shoulders. He received military training and was promoted to colonel in the Syrian army, a crash course in the art of control that would define his rule. This period of intense training and indoctrination was designed to instill in Bashar the skills and mindset necessary to lead a nation. The transformation from a mild-mannered doctor to a military leader was swift and dramatic, as Bashar began to embrace the role that had been thrust upon him. The once unassuming ophthalmologist was now on a path that would lead him to become one of the most controversial and polarizing figures in modern history.
When Hafez El-Assad died in the year 2000, after 3 decades of iron-fisted rule, his son Bashar inherited the presidency. The transition of power was smooth, but the expectations were high. The people of Syria, who had lived under a strict regime for so long, were eager for change and hopeful for a brighter future. Initially, there was a sense of cautious optimism. The streets of Damascus buzzed with conversations about potential reforms and newfound freedoms. People dared to dream of a different Syria, one where their voices could be heard and their opinions mattered. Bashar, with his Western education and modern outlook, was seen as a potential reformer. He had studied ophthalmology in London and was familiar with Western ideals of democracy and human rights. This background gave many Syrians hope that he would bring a fresh perspective to the presidency and steer the country towards a more open and progressive future. The period following his ascension, dubbed the Damascus Spring, saw a brief flourishing of political and social debate. Intellectuals, activists, and ordinary citizens began to engage in discussions about the future of their country. Public gatherings and political debates became more common, and there was a palpable sense of excitement in the air. Internet cafes sprang up, offering a platform for open discussion and criticism of the government. For the first time, people could connect with the outside world and share their thoughts freely. The internet became a tool for empowerment, allowing Syrians to voice their opinions and challenge the status quo. This was a stark contrast to the oppressive silence that had characterized his father's reign. Political prisoners were released, and families were reunited after years of separation. The release of these prisoners was seen as a sign of goodwill and a step towards a more just and fair society. There were even whispers of democratic reforms. People began to believe that real change was possible, that Syria could transform into a nation where democracy and freedom were not just dreams, but attainable realities. Small political gatherings and reform meetings started to take place, and the atmosphere was charged with hope and anticipation. For a fleeting moment, it seemed like Syria might be on the cusp of a new era. The hopeful crowds in Damascus, the celebrations, and the positive atmosphere all pointed towards a brighter future. It was a time of dreams and possibilities, where the old ways seemed to be giving way to a new dawn. However, this period of openness was short-lived. The initial euphoria began to fade as the reality of the situation set in. Protests started to emerge, and the government's response was swift and brutal. The crackdown on dissent was harsh, and the police presence in the streets became a constant reminder of the limits of this newfound freedom. The old guard, wary of losing their grip on power, began to clamp down on dissent. The military leaders and government officials who had thrived under Hafez El-Assad's rule were not ready to relinquish their control. They saw the reforms as a threat to their authority and moved quickly to stifle any opposition. Bashar, facing resistance from within his own government, chose to consolidate power rather than embrace reform. The pressures from the old guard and the challenges of governing a nation in transition proved too great. Instead of pushing forward with the changes that many had hoped for, he reverted to the familiar tactics of control and suppression. The Damascus Spring, like a flower denied sunlight, began to wither. The hopes and dreams of a new era slowly faded away, replaced by a sense of disillusionment and despair. The brief period of openness and possibility was over, and Syria returned to a state of repression and control. The promise of the Damascus Spring had been extinguished, leaving behind a legacy of what could have been.
The hope for a reformed Syria under Bashar al-Assad quickly evaporated. When Bashar al-Assad first came to power, there was a wave of optimism. Many Syrians believed that he would bring about much-needed reforms and lead the country into a new era of openness and progress. The initial signs were promising, with talk of modernization and a more liberal approach to governance. However, this hope was short-lived, as the regime reverted to its authoritarian ways. The government began to tighten its grip on power, and the initial promises of reform were replaced by a harsh reality. The military presence in the streets became more pronounced, and the police force was used to intimidate and control the population. The internet, once a beacon of free speech, was heavily censored. Websites that were critical of the regime were blocked, and online discussions were monitored. The government used sophisticated technology to track and suppress dissenting voices. This crackdown on digital freedom was a clear indication that the regime was not interested in allowing any form of opposition. Political opponents were silenced, imprisoned, or disappeared. Activists who dared to speak out against the regime were arrested and often subjected to torture. Many were held without trial, and their families were left in the dark about their whereabouts. The fear of being targeted by the government became a daily reality for many Syrians. The seeds of tyranny, sown in the shadow of the Damascus Spring, began to take root. The brief period of political openness known as the Damascus Spring had given way to a climate of fear and repression. The government's actions during this time laid the groundwork for the brutal crackdown that would follow. One of the most significant turning points was the arrest and imprisonment of activists and intellectuals who had dared to criticize the regime. These individuals were often well-respected members of society who had initially supported Bashar al-Assad, hoping that he would bring about positive change. Their arrests sent shockwaves through the country and served as a stark warning to others. These individuals, many of whom had initially supported Bashar, were accused of undermining national security and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The charges were often vague and politically motivated, designed to silence any form of dissent. The trials were a mere formality, with the outcome predetermined by the regime. Their arrests sent a chilling message: dissent would not be tolerated. The regime's actions created an atmosphere of fear and mistrust. People were afraid to speak out, knowing that they could be arrested at any moment. The government's message was clear. Any challenge to its authority would be met with swift and severe punishment. The regime's crackdown on dissent was swift and brutal. Protests were met with overwhelming force, and the security forces were given free rein to use whatever means necessary to suppress opposition. The violence and brutality of the regime's response shocked the world and highlighted the lengths to which Bashar al-Assad was willing to go to maintain his grip on power, effectively crushing any hopes for a peaceful transition to democracy. The dream of a democratic Syria was shattered, and the country was plunged into a dark period of repression and violence. The regime's actions left little room for hope, and many Syrians were left feeling disillusioned and betrayed. Bashar, once seen as a potential reformer, had revealed his true colours: a ruthless dictator willing to silence any opposition to maintain his grip on power. His transformation from a hopeful leader to a tyrant was complete, and the consequences for Syria were devastating. The country's future was now uncertain, and the seeds of tyranny had firmly taken root. The stage was set for the tragedy that would unfold. The regime's actions had sown the seeds of a conflict that would tear the country apart and lead to unimaginable suffering for the Syrian people. The hope for a better future had been replaced by a grim reality, and the world watched as Syria descended into chaos and violence.